Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I will talk about the 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they have to be a promo. For that I compiled a list of all decks that topped an official DireWolf event or reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. Tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. The promo rarity was introduced in August 2016 with Scouting Party, but DireWolf only started with regular monthly promos in late 2017 and weekly promos in 2022. They vary wildly in strength. Some are outright bad, others are interesting build-around cards or support for fringe decks without much of a competitive impact, and still others saw significant competitive play because they lined up well against the best decks, pushed weaker decks into playability, or because they fit into already established strong decks. In this video I will talk about the last group, the 10 promos with the most competitive success. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards made the top of the list, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments. And with that, let's begin. Our first card is Cham Laser Cannon. It's a 3 power, 1 fire influence, 3/3 weapon. When the wielder attacks, it gets heated, and when it was already heated before the attack, the wielder gets +3 attack and overwhelm this turn, then it cools down. That means on every second turn it enables a huge swing with +6 attack and overwhelm, which is a strong bonus for an already decent baseline. Cannon was released in June 2021, about a month after Set 11 Revelations. It saw some immediate play in Set 11 Expedition in different shades of Fire Aggro decks, but it took until Set 12 Cold Hunt and the release of strong aggressive cards, especially in Rakano, like Inferno Phoenix and Helena Skyguide from the same set, and Furious Magniventress and Carnivorous Yearling from its corresponding campaigns, for Cannon to really shine. It was widely played in Rakano and to a lesser degree Stonescar and Skycrack aggro in Set 12 Expedition, because it could help finish games quickly, especially if you put it on cheap units with evasion, like Styre's Eyes or Crownwatch Paladin, but it was often played at less than 4 copies because it was risky into removal, unless you had a unit with Aegis to put it on. In Throne it wasn't quite as successful and didn't see any play in 2021, but it had some tops in Rakano, Skycrack and Stonescar aggro in 2022. Next up we have Garden of Omens. It's a 5 power, double fire and primal influence 2 health side. As a passive it makes your spells uncounterable and bypass Aegis. Its 3 spells are Resurface, Ice Bolt and Meltdown, so a value option in Resurface, unit removal with Ice Bolt and relic removal with Meltdown. And when you manage to complete it, you get Tamaris the Geomancer, a 5 cost 4/4 flyer that reduces the cost of your spells by 1. That was also the original passive of Garden before it got nerfed for the first time. That version would have easily ended up higher on this list despite being a fairly expensive dual faction card that only fits into specific decks, but DireWolf nerfed it twice because they deemed its potential for control decks as too strong. The first nerf came only 2 months after it got released in late 2019. It lost 1 health point and got an influence increase, but that nerf didn't affect its playability for 2 and mostly other 3 faction control decks too much, proven by its success in Skycrack, FPS and FGP Control in the 2020 season. In FGP Control it even won Worlds in 2020 in the hands of Lights Out Ace. In 2021 it fell a bit out of favor, mostly because Control as a whole was worse, and if people played Control they preferred to play Horu. But even though it only had 8 tops throughout the whole season, DireWolf decided to nerf it again, this time with a complete rework of the passive. That nerf made it way weaker in Control, where it would often win the game if it survived the turn before the nerf, because control decks could get a ton of tempo by playing multiple spells each turn for reduced cost. But Garden still saw some tops in 2022, mostly in different shades of Skycrack midrange. On rank 8 we have Know When to Hold 'Em. It's a 1 power, 1 primal influence spell that draws any card of your choice from a deck, but you can't play that card for the next 5 turns. Waiting 5 turns is way too long, so No One was only good when you could cheat around the downside, usually by drawing a card with a fade effect. But despite that narrow use case, its competitive history is littered with nerfs that it at least partially caused. It took No One a few months to see competitive success. It came out in summer 2022, but despite the existence of strong Fade cards like Jotunhurler, who drew a Snowball on Fade, and Xo, who drew a Trove on Fade, it got 0 tops in the 2020 season. The 2 main cards that brought it into the spotlight were Cruel Kumok Occultist and Broken Contract, both released between the 2020 and 2021 season. They enabled an FPS token deck in both formats, so Expedition and Throne. Both of those variants played a lot of cheap efficient units that you could bring back with Cruel's Fade effect, and ways to draw onto Cruel reliably, like No One or Whispering Wind. In Throne, people also played Praxis Trove to have even more consistent access to Cruel or Broken Contract, because they would play No One to hold them as their only 1 power spell, which meant any 1-drop could tutor one of the Fade cards, which would then play a 2-drop to trigger Trove again, because Trove wasn't a once per turn effect back then. But both Cruel, which now exhausted the unit she brought back, and Trove got nerfed, and No One rotated out of Expedition in mid-2021, which left it without a home for the rest of 2021, except for occasional appearances in Skycreek midrange and Control to fetch Hurler or Xo before they got nerfed in early 2022. The Nerf Hammer also got the last deck, or rather 2-card combo, in which No One was heavily played in, Nico Threat. Before June 2022, Auto Threat's effect could be used multiple times per turn, so you could discard Nico as often as you had power to get a huge threat, a huge Nico, and to deal some damage to the opponent's face. That combination was so good that people even played it in decks that couldn't even play Nico from hand, meaning decks without Shadow Influence like Skycrack midrange, because you didn't need to play Nico from hand, and No One was a great way to get Nico more consistently in those decks because the downside of not being able to play Nico was irrelevant. After the nerf to Dread, that combo, and with it No One to hold him, fell out of favor, but it could definitely become a dangerous card again in the future if we get another strong Fade or Fade-like effects. Next up we have Exodus. It's a 3 power, 1 fire and 1 time influence spell with Inscribe, meaning you can play it as a depleted fire or time sigil instead of using it for its spell effect, and that spell effect would grant all your units +1/+1, charge and endurance. Exodus was released halfway through the 2022 season, so it didn't have a lot of time to collect points, but the option to choose between a dual faction Inscribe and a strong board buff made it stable in both Throne and Expedition. In the format was pretty much exclusively played in Creation Project decks. Those played lots of cheap units and token producers like Grenadin, Drone or Dinosaur Nest, which made a board-wide buff very valuable, and the upside of Exodus being additional power that could fix for 1 of 2 different factions was great too. It also helped that Exodus cost 3, because Project often used Fearless Crescendo as their market access, especially before Crescendo was nerfed from 1 to 2 cost. Exodus was a great target for Crescendo because it could fix the influence with both factions that you could be missing in FTJ when you played Crescendo. In Expedition, Exodus was also played in Creation Project decks after that came out in August 2022, but it already saw widespread play before that in Praxis midrange decks. Those didn't play quite as many cheap units and token creators as Throne Project lists, but they still had a few like Waystone Igniter or Dinosaur Nest, and the deck wanted more than 25 raw power, with Exodus being the best card in that Expedition format to accomplish that. Lastly, it was part of the world-winning FTS token Expedition deck from Apple Chips, which included additional Go White cards like Collection Rounds, Rickety Ram card, and the Red King. Next up, we have our second set 11 promo, Javan the Steel Crest. He's a 3 power, 1 time influence, 3/3 unit that allows you to pay 4 to draw a card and immediately play it if it's a unit with cost 4 or less, and if he attacks, all your units played that turn gain +1/+1. He was an important piece of time midrange decks in set 11 and set 12 Expedition, most importantly Praxis, Xenon and TGP heroes. His unique mix of early pressure that can steamroll a game by buffing anything you play, and infinite card advantage if he didn't get removed made him a cheap threat that had to be answered fast. The draw effect could sometimes be frustrating for your opponent because of its high variance. Drawing and immediately playing something like a Sandstorm Titan could swing around games hard. But even with all those strengths, he was never good enough for Throne and only saw a little bit of success in Compre and Xenon midrange decks in 2022. Paying 4 to draw was just too slow, and Throne had a lot more cheap answers to the Javan, for example Torch or Open Contract. And we proceed with another set 11 promo, Quinn Master Tracker. Quinn is a 5 power, double primal influence 3/4 unit with Aegis that draws a copy of the top card of the opponent's deck on summon, and it stuns the next unit that the opponent plays as an ultimate. They were a very strong standalone card that pretty much all non-aggro primal decks were interested in, which allowed him to rack up an impressive 51 points in the 2021 Expedition season in just 3 months. Quinn always replaced themselves in terms of card advantage, and the Aegis and Ultimate meant that they made an impact on the board despite the small stat line. That whole package made them see widespread play in Feln, Horu and FPS midrange decks. In early 2022 Expedition, Primal midrange barely existed, but Quinn still got some points in Horu midrange and TGP Heroes. While Quinn was a buff rate in Expedition, a 5-drop needed and still needs to do much more in Throne to see play, so Quinn couldn't get a single top there. On rank 4, we go back to set 13 with Groga Burdened Hero. He's a 5 power, double time influence, 5/5 unit with Overwhelm, and on summon you get 5 life and silence an enemy unit with 3 or less attack. He came out 1 week after Exodus and managed to get even more points in just the second half of the 2022 season, but contrary to Exodus, he was mostly an Expedition card. He still saw a little bit of success in Throne as a stabilizer against aggro in the main deck of slower midrange decks like Xenon or TGS, and as a flexible market option for Crack the Earth market of FTJ Creation Project decks. But most of its points come from Expedition. There he was played in pretty much all-time midrange decks, most importantly Xenon, Praxis, FDS, Compre and FTJ Project. His deadline made him a big threat that could survive widely played removal like Stonebreaker Bow and Lunar Claw, and block commonly played units like Blank Wumpkin. Add to that the life gain to stabilize against aggro, and the ability to silence the threats that he couldn't always block, like Furious Magnaventris, Feln Adept or Parliament Elder. And you have pretty much the perfect midrange unit against anything but hard control decks, which barely existed in set 13 Expedition. We continue to go deeper into set 13 with Shizu Silver Hit. She's a 3 power, 1 fire influence 3/2 unit that plays a 1/0 weapon with Overwhelm on one of your units on summon, and whenever another one of your units dies while equipped with a weapon, you get to draw a card. Similarly to Groga, she was mostly an Expedition card, but she had some success in Throne in Rakano Onis and Rakano and Stonska aggro. In Expedition she was also mainly played in aggro, with the Expedition aggro deck of choice in set 13 being FPS aggro. Shizu was already a pretty good unit on her own, especially for Expedition standards, but the synergies she had with the other cards in that deck made her a clear staple for it. The most important use case was to play the weapon on Feln Adept. If you could achieve that on turn 3, your opponent needed an immediate answer or you could just run away with the game because you get to draw a card every turn with Adept. But even if they had removal for Adept, you already got 1 draw out of Adept most of the time, and you got to draw another card on removal thanks to Shizu's second effect. Additionally, you could just play the weapon on evasive units like Blank, Inferno Phoenix, Rickety Rampart or DireWolf Pack, and in the worst case you could still just play Shizu as a 4/2 with Overwhelm because you could play the weapon on herself too. Despite several nerfs to FPS aggro, the deck stayed strong until the end of 2022 Expedition, which was enough for Shizu to reach the number 3 spot on this list. And on rank 2 we have another FPS aggro staple, Seal's Stronghold. It's a 4 power, 1 fire and 1 shadow influence, 3 health side. As a passive it grants +2 attack and Overwhelm to one of your units until the end of your turn if that unit attacks alone. Its 3 spells are Threaten, Guns Blazing and Victimless Crime, and when you manage to complete the side, you get Seal No Regrets. That means it can remove a non-hero unit when you play it, and then enable better attacks every turn thanks to the passive and the 2 other spells, which makes it very good in aggressive decks that plan to be ahead on board on turn 4 anyway. While it had slightly more expedition tops than throne tops, it was still widely played in throne. Its most important home there was Dawn's Aggro, in which it acted as top end that could kill strong roadblocks like Furious Magniventress, Minecrafter or any merchant, but it was also played in midrange decks like Stone's Seal or FGS midrange. In Expedition it was only legal for set 13 format, despite being part of set 12, because it came out after the last set 12 tournament. In set 13 Expedition it was a staple in FPS aggro, which makes up most of its 53 tops. Like Shizu, it could be used to enable attacks with Fell'n Adept by buffing it with Threaten. The overwhelming attack buff on attack also made DireWolf pack or Blank even more threatening. And Victimless Crime could take out commonly played units like Fell'n Adept, Dune Hill Clan or Furious Magniventress. But all of that success was not even close to enough to challenge the number 1 on this list, which most of you might have guessed by now, especially because I mentioned him multiple times throughout the video already. I'm of course talking about Blank Wumpkin, who takes the number 1 spot with an impressive 104 point lead on Stronghold. He's a 2 power, 1 primal influence, 3/1 unit with Aegis, Valor and Voidbound, and when he hits the enemy player, or when the enemy makes you discard him, you can take 2 depth to draw a card. He was the first promo for set 12, released shortly before the end of the 2021 season, and he still managed to get a total of 53 tops between both formats in just the respective last chance qualifiers and the World Championship finals. In Throne he slotted right into all primal aggro and midrange decks, most importantly Horu Kira, Skycrack midrange, TGP aggro, Feln midrange and Skycrack aggro. His ability to pressure an opponent while gaining card advantage, all while being protected from most removal, at least for one time, made him a staple that every non-control primal deck had to at least think about playing. In Expedition he was even stronger because some widely played soft counters like Vinecrafter, Desert Marshal or Darkwater Vines didn't exist. Instead people opted to play more cheap efficient relic weapons to not lose the early blanks, like Lootstrung Bow, Stonebreaker Bow, Lunar Claw or Miner's Musket. The later also had the upside of enabling Unleash high rolls before Unleash got nerfed. For the first Expedition ICQ, Blank was also a very risky play into an opponent's dinosaur nest, because instead of the overwhelmed dino, Nest could still play a killer dino back then, which of course could just killer down a Blank. But Nest got nerfed in May 2022, so Blank was a lot safer after that again. But all of those soft counters, or sometimes even hard counters, weren't enough to stop Blank from seeing tons of Expedition play. In set 12 Expedition he was a huge buff for all hero decks, because he was a cheap hero that you could play with Xultan Ambassador to draw additional cards, and Aegis made him a great carrier for gold-plated Revolver. But he was also a staple in non-hero Horu and Skycrack midrange, and in Skycrack aggro decks in set 12. He fell off a little bit in the second set 12 tourney at the start of the 22 season, thanks to the aforementioned killer dinos from Dinosaur Nest, which got released between the 2 tournaments, and thanks to the weakness of primal midrange and aggro compared to Rakano aggro. But he came back in full force in set 13 Expedition. Like Shizu and Stronghold, he was a staple in FPS aggro, but he was also played in almost every primal deck, like Horu midrange and even Horu control, JPS midrange and Skycrack midrange. Despite his dominance, he was never nerfed and has now been a pivotal but balanced part of the Throne meta for more than 2 years. This marks the end of the 9th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the introduction video and the previous episodes on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.